George Clooney drew the attention of our illustrious president, well, not for the first time. Donald Trump calls George Clooney a second-rate movie star after Clooney calls out the government for trying to make journalists smaller. This is what Trump had to say. Why would the now highly discredited 60 Minutes be doing a total puff piece on George Clooney, a second-rate movie star, all with the weird quotations on it, and failed political pundit? He fought hard for Sleepy Joe's election, and then right after the debate, dumped him like a dog. Later, I assume under orders from the Obama camp, pushed all out for Kamala, only to soon realize that that was not going to work out too well. T-O, not T-O-O in his version. Yeah. 60 Minutes even fraudulently inserted fake answers into her disastrous interview aired just before Election Day in one of the most embarrassing and dishonest events in broadcast history. And now George Clooney again? His press agent should be making a fortune. All right. So Clooney is right now kind of doing a press tour to promote his upcoming Broadway version of his movie Good Night and Good Luck. I have often referenced this movie over the years on the show as a great example of how oblivious the liberals are to the fact that they've become McCarthyites, because they all love this movie. They all love this movie. And the irony of the fact that they've become the mindless McCarthyites portrayed in this movie completely escapes them. That's why it's coming to Broadway. Who do you think goes to Broadway mostly? Jukebox musicals, that's tourists. But this kind of Broadway, that's lips. When I went to Curse of the Starving Class, I think I could have sat in any seat in the house, and I would have had people, as I did, Trump, 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 right behind me. So that's who this is for. It's the same people they do To Kill a Mockingbird. They love that too, because it's mean to poor white people. So Clooney went on 60 Minutes, and we're just going to listen to a little bit of this.
States fail, when the judiciary and the executive and the legislative branches fail us, the fourth estate has to succeed. Has to succeed. As 60 Minutes is here right now on our first day.
Kidding aside, Clooney made the point, these are chilling times for the news media.
ABC has just settled a lawsuit with the Trump administration, and CBS News is in the process of...
Okay, so because of their very self-apologetic explanation for the lawsuit they're involved in, I'm going to pull Variety's explanation. ABC News agreed in December to pay $15 million and issue a statement of apology to settle Trump's defamation lawsuit against George Stephanopoulos and the network after the anchor inaccurately stated the president-elect was liable for rape. Trump is currently suing CBS and 60 Minutes for $10 billion, alleging the news program tried to mislead voters by airing two different edits of remarks made in an interview with Kamala Harris before the election. The president has called for 60 Minutes to be terminated. Now, yes, I think anybody who followed that story, now in their version, it's completely unjustified that he's suing for this. I think $10 billion is probably excessive. I don't even know if what they did falls under election interference. Maybe it does. I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with the relevant articles of law. Was it scummy? Was it intentional? Did it reflect a bias towards Kamala Harris? Certainly it did. And that's something that George Clooney is not going to get into. So he continues.
This idea of using government to scare or fine or use corporations to make journalists smaller. Governments don't like the freedom of the press. They never have. And that goes for whether you are a conservative or a liberal or whatever side you're on, they don't like the press.
What does this play tell us about the media's ability or willingness to withstand this kind of pressure?
It's a fight that is for the ages. It will continue. You see it happening at the LA Times. You see it happening at the Washington Post, for God's sake.
This is what's so frustrating and so maddening about libs, and the reason that legitimate leftists don't want to be represented by them, want them to get out of the way, because they're hurting the causes they claim to champion. If you live in the bubble that George Clooney lives in, the Washington Post used to be credible, but now, now they're bending the knee to Trump. Whereas if you live on planet Earth, and this isn't just the left, this is a lot of MAGA folks as well. That is where the Venn diagram between us overlaps. Recognize that the media is a propaganda arm of the establishment. So, for example, did George Clooney speak out when the Washington Post smeared 200 outlets as Russian propaganda? This is back when Taibbi was still at Rolling Stone. Those of you who have been in the trenches for a while might remember this story. This was back in 2016. Last week, a technology reporter for the Washington Post named Craig Timberg ran an incredible story. It has no analog that I can think of in modern times. Headlined, "Russian Propaganda Effort Helped Spread Fake News During Election," experts say. The piece promotes the work of a shadowy group that smears some 200 alternative news outlets as either knowing or unwitting agents of a foreign power, including popular sites like Truthdig and Naked Capitalism. George Clooney speak out about that? Did he speak out about how all of these independent media sources, many of which were left media like Truthdig, were being suppressed by a shadowy organization funded by shadowy sources, and that the Washington Post was using that as a source to make these kinds of claims? Did he say anything about Adpocalypse, which was particularly aimed at independent news gatherers like Truthdig, about how many independent left-wing creators had their whole ability to continue to do this collapse overnight because of pressure from the kinds of people who were funding those kinds of articles in the Washington Post? Now, needless to say, as I mentioned, the greatest irony is that he's doing a play about McCarthyism, and he would never say anything about this. Now, some of you might remember this clip. It's from one episode of the Maddow Show. The original file I could not find, but I did find it being covered by one Mr. Jimmy Dore on an outlet that he has since departed from.
And I'm going to play it for you. Here we go.
Vladimir Putin, Russia hates Russia, Putin, Russia, Moscow, Russian, pro-Russian, the Russians, Moscow, Russia, Putin, Russia against us, Russia against the U.S., the Russian government scheme. The Russians, Vladimir Putin, Putin and Russia, Moscow, Russia, the Russians, Putin, Russia, the Soviet Empire, the second of the 20th century's great evils, communism, communism, Russia, assault by Russia,
Putin despises the West in general and the United States in particular, the Soviet Empire. Russia. They're the adversary. They want to bring us down, the Soviet Union.
Okay, that's all for that show. That was from one show.
From one show? That was from one episode?
That was from one episode of the Rachel Maddow Show. So
wow.
George Clooney, this is the insight someone like George Clooney will never have. because you did not speak out about this, that is why nobody gives a shit about these outlets that you're talking about. That's why nobody gives a shit about the LA Times. Nobody gives a shit about the Washington Post. Nobody gives a shit about the New York Times. This is why people, ourselves included, who are certainly not fans of Donald Trump, would find that post hilarious. That is Trump. That is Trump's trump card, so to speak. His ability to lampoon the hypocrisy of the liberal class, which he does very effectively, although you could say it's a pretty easy target because of these rich celebrities like George Clooney, who, as Trump points out, he was for Obama, or he was for Biden, and then supposedly there's some pretty credible reporting that Obama used him to get Biden out of the race. He wrote that op-ed, and then everyone turned on him after Kamala lost, which he deserved. And now he's out there with no sense of irony, doing a Broadway version of a play about McCarthyism while decrying attacks on outlets that were behind this Russiagate mania that in the end, I believe, and I think any objective observer would believe, helped Trump in the end because it so completely destroyed the credibility of those same outlets. When Clooney goes on 60 Minutes and makes this kind of a critique of media, it's not helping. It's hurting. It's hurting. It's reminding people why they voted for Donald Trump when they see a guy like Clooney going up there and crying about how the Washington Post now is dishonest, whereas before they were doing a good job.
Yeah, when I found out that he was doing a revival of this play, I thought it was really interesting because, well, first of all, the movie itself could have been a stage play. It all basically takes place in one room, and it's very dialogue driven. So formatting wise, I think it makes sense. But it's interesting because when that movie came out in 2005, it was using the anti-communist paranoia of the McCarthy era as a metaphor for the paranoia of the day, which was the war on terror Bush era paranoia. And as we talked about with Dave DeCamp earlier in the show, and as Greenwald did a piece on this week, a lot of that same paranoia is being revived by the Trump administration, whose base really considers them a Republican sort of alternative to the George W. Bush brand. And so in that respect, it wasn't terribly surprising that this project would sort of come back into relevance. The problem is, in order to take it seriously, you have to memory hole the 20 years between when it came out as a movie in 2005 and now, because in between that period of time, there was a whole lot of McCarthyism going on that was being cheered on by the likes of George Clooney himself. So it's not that it's not relevant now. I don't think it's so much not relevant now as it is, in order to take it seriously now, you really have to Men in Black flashy thing the 20-year gap between when it first came out and now. You have to just pretend that never happened.
Well, this is the problem with Clooney and liberals like Clooney. They can never admit that their own politics set the stage for fascism. And because of that, they always miss the point. What he's saying about the press is not wrong on the face of it, but he completely misses the fact that his idea of what is the good and the true is actually the underlying problem. It's not even part of the problem. It is literally the problem. The institutions he thinks are the good institutions that need to be defended, it is their corruption and their inability to be honest with the public that made Trump look good to people. He looked honest by comparison.
Yeah. And just as a little end note to this segment, because you mentioned To Kill a Mockingbird, about how it's mean to poor white people. It's funny because the Aaron Sorkin Broadway play version of it was actually mean to poor white people. It's funny. You reminded me of a piece that there's an interview that he gave.
That's what I was thinking of. It's not an accident that they brought that back to Broadway.
Right. No, but Sorkin wrote the script
No,
for
I
the
know,
play.
I know,
So he put
I know.
his elite liberal spin on
Yep.
the story. And in my opinion, totally, and this was what was really funny about it, because I remember he gave an interview about this, where I remember, like, you're taking one of the great heroes in all of American literature, Atticus Finch, and reducing him to a bitter lib like yourself. Because he says, you know, in this version of the play, which seems much more of the time, Atticus realizes at the end that he was wrong about who his neighbors were, and he was very surprised by what racist bigots they were. As if the moral of the story is he should hate them more at the end. Whereas what makes Atticus such a noble hero in the book, what makes him such a great hero of literature, is the fact that he has empathy for these villainous people despite their horrible flaws. Like, one of the most beautiful lines in the book is where he's talking to his daughter Scout at the beginning, and he says, now over the course of these next few weeks, when, you know, he's got to represent this innocent black man who's going to be lynched for something he didn't do, he says, you know, our friends are going to be saying some really horrible things about me. I want you to remember that they're still our friends. Like, that is such a beautiful line. Like, it's such a, that's what makes him such a hero, right? Is the fact that even in the face of this horror, we're still going to see the humanity in these. And Sorkin just totally throws that out. And now he didn't realize what piece of shit they
That's
are.
where Harper Lee went wrong.
Yeah, exactly. That's where Harper Lee went wrong. Like, just totally fucking misses the whole point of the book. Because he's too invested in his liberal intellectual snobbery.
No, dude. As soon as I saw they were doing that on Broadway and that it was an Aaron Sorkin adaptation, with that, I knew exactly where they were going with that.
Yeah, exactly. Just take one of, like, the most profound characters in literature and just reduce it to your fucking liberal bullshit.
Please clap.